Man, that's tough, 18 years. It's kind of like that other story in the gospel where the man is sitting by the pool. He's been brought there for 40 years and laid there, and every time the angel comes and troubles the water, he can't get in the water. The first one that gets in the water gets healed, but he can't get there. Well, of course not. He's lame. He can't get there. Who gets in the water first when the angel troubles the water? The guy with the ingrown toenail. You know, the guy with a bad case of dandruff. He gets in first. The sick people don't get in first. They're sick. And this poor woman comes in, gets healed on the wrong day. I bet she's embarrassed. Now she's the center of attention. And the very ruler of the synagogue begins to say to everyone, doesn't have enough courage to confront Jesus directly, so he confronts the people. He starts saying to them, y'all don't need to come here on the Sabbath day to get healed. You got 6 days a week for healing. Don't come on this day. Now remember, she didn't come in to get healed. He's really attacking Jesus for healing her on that day. She didn't ask for it. Jesus just gave it freely, radically to her. She didn't ask for it, but the ruler of the synagogue is telling people, don't expect it on this day. Go away. How'd they get so mixed up? Jesus said, if you have an ox or a donkey and it's thirsty, you can water them on the Sabbath day. You and I are thinking, how in the world could watering an animal be bad on the Sabbath day? Well, here's what was bad about it. You had to untie the knot. That was working. Did you know they even had rules about what kind of knots you could tie on the Sabbath day? Some knots were worked and some knots weren't. And you think it's tough remembering what time the evening service starts. That'd be difficult. So they could tie certain knots they couldn't. You could walk no more than 2,000 cubits, less than the length of the ark, to water the animal. But you could walk 2,000 cubits, but you couldn't put anything on the animal because then the animal would be working. You weren't supposed to court on the Sabbath, but I'm going to guess that young people found a way around that. And young people would say things like, Dad, you want me to water the ox? Because then you could walk it over to your girlfriend's house. You know, she might be outside. You think I'm kidding. My granddad loved to watch baseball, and he was a Yankees fan. I guess everybody in those days had to be a Yankees fan. So he would watch the Yankees on television, on his black and white television in Dublin, Texas. But when Sunday would come around, he would always say, you can't watch TV on the Sabbath. No TV watching on the Sabbath. Unless it's church. We walked into his house one Sunday, and he was sitting there watching the Yankees on TV. I said, Pop, what are you doing? And he jumped up and started flipping the channel. He said, I know Billy Graham's on here somewhere. If they'd had remote controls back then, my granddad wouldn't have even needed grandkids, I'll tell you. He could have just kind of moved those things around on his own. We get things mixed up, don't we? And here's what Jesus says. You can show compassion to a donkey. You can water an ox, but your heart's not broken over a woman bound by Satan for 18 years. You're good people. But somehow you got all this stuff mixed up. Oh, I've had people tell me things over the years. Oh, we can't do that program in the church. We've got new carpet. We can't do that particular program and have homeless people that might sleep at our building because we've got new paint. And somewhere you have to hear Jesus say, you can show compassion on a piece of fabric and clean it and replace it. Ought not we show mercy to people? It's just a story that's there for us about getting these priorities exactly in order. I love this part of the text there. Jesus said to them, "Should not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, be set free?" Men and women weren't even in the same part of the church. Greg, it had been men on this side, women on this side in the synagogue. And then you had to have adjusted your loveliness factor accordingly. But they'd be on opposite sides. And the women wouldn't speak up. Only the men could speak out. Women had to remain silent. And so this woman is the theme of the event that day, if you will. And Jesus calls attention to her. You know she's got to be terrified, mortified, embarrassed. But here she is down front, and the whole discussion is about her and whether she's really been healed or not, or it was right or not. And Jesus is speaking to her. And plus, she's been stooped over for 18 years. We had a lady in our church in College Station, joined about 2 years ago, and she couldn't look. She was stooped that way. She never let it stop her. She still drives a car. And when she stood down front and greeted everybody that came by, for her to look at us, she'd have to turn around like this and look up. But there's a smile on her face that said she stood straighter than anybody. This woman now in Israel has been called a sinner for 18 years because of her malady. And the text might be translated with the idea that she couldn't look up. She couldn't look up. She couldn't look up and see someone in the eye. Do you know how important that is to be able to look somebody in the eye? And Jesus takes her and straightens her up. Now listen to what He says. In the presence of the religious leaders, He said, "This woman, this daughter of Abraham, has been bound, and now she's free." She's free. It's a story of confronting evil. It's a story of confronting evil. It's the evil of misplaced priorities. We've already seen that. But there's another evil that's here. In essence, the ruler of the synagogue said, "She's been this way for 18 years. You can come back tomorrow. You can get healed tomorrow." Isn't that true? I mean, you know, if you had something wrong with you for 18 years, what's one more day? Except that one more day is a further compromise with people who have their priorities so messed up. Jesus is confronting an unhealthy peace here. Our history is littered with things like this. Our nation begins. Founding fathers get together and say, "Let's make a nation here. Let's rebel against England." And, well, there's a little bit of a problem. You see, the colonies in the South had slaves, and the colonies in the North not so much. How are we going to be a nation? Are we going to be slave holders or not slave holders? And so they debated, and they come up with what we refer to often as being a compromise. And compromises are important for people to be able to live together at times. But sometimes these compromises do some pretty funny, strange things, don't they? So this nation at its very beginning decides we're going to have slave states and we're going to have free states. And then further compromises have to be made. People in the free states say, well, slaves don't count in representation. People in the slave states say, well, that's not fair. They ought to count because they're working. They're part of the economy, and they ought to count. They should count. They're not going to vote. They don't get any rights, but they ought to count for our representation. So they have another compromise. They come up with this marvelous little statement. I say that word facetiously, of course, that a slave counts as 3/5 of a human being toward representation. But they really were not treated as human beings. 3/5, 1/5, or 1/1,000,000th. They're slaves. Compromise. And somehow or another, good people, in order to get along, sometimes will compromise truths that, quite frankly, ought not be compromised.